All right, here we are. Good morning. So, good to see you all this morning. Let's start off just with what's going on this week in the Jewish calendar and with the Parsha, and then we'll get to our really important topic that I know everyone's anxious for. I've been preparing for a long time. I'm very excited about this one. We'll talk about the Cairo Genizah. We'll get to that shortly. Just firstly, this week is this Tuesday is the fast of the 10th of Tevet. It is one of four fast days that we have commemorating the destruction of the temple. The 10th of Tevet marks the day that the Babylonians besieged Jerusalem before the destruction of the first temple, and it was the beginning, essentially, of the end, the beginning of the destruction. And so we fast the morning to night fast. If people are sick, they don't have to fast, but we start in the morning when the first light is visible, and it ends at dark. Get the exact times.
It starts Monday night?
It's Tuesday. It starts Tuesday morning at exactly first lights visible at 5:34, and it ends at 5:23. So it starts late and ends early because we're in the winter fast. This week's Parsha is Parshat Vayechi. It is the concluding Parsha of the first book of the Torah, Genesis, Bereshit. So when we finish this Parsha, we will be 1/5 of the way through the Torah reading. And this week's Parsha begins with Jacob's already in Egypt with his entire family, who came to Egypt at the beginning of last week's Parsha, in the middle of last week's Parsha. And he lives there for 17 years. At the end of his life, he asks Joseph when he dies not to bury him in Egypt, but to take him up to Canaan, to the cave of Machpelah. Joseph then brings his two sons, Menashe and Ephraim, to be blessed by Jacob. At first, the Torah tells us how Jacob put his right hand on one son, on Menashe, on Ephraim, on the younger son, and his left hand on the older son. Usually the right is the stronger of the hands and the stronger blessing. And so Joseph tried switching it, and Yaakov said, no, Ephraim will be the greater of the tribes. And indeed, Joshua, who would be Moses' successor, the one to lead the Jews into the land of Israel, was a descendant of Ephraim. Then he blesses the two children, saying that all of Israel will bless their children with you. And indeed, when we bless our children, we tell them, Yisimcha Elokim ke Ephraim v'che Menashe, God should make you like Ephraim and Menashe. So they are like our models that we bless our children with. Then Yaakov calls all his 12 sons, and he blesses each one of the sons. There's a unique blessing. It's very cryptic and poetic, the blessings, but it goes through blessings for each of the 12 sons. And then Yaakov again reminds his children when he dies to take him up to the cave of Machpelah in Hebron and bury him there. And then Yaakov dies. When he dies, Yosef gets permission from Pharaoh to take Jacob, and he and all his family, they all travel to the land of Canaan. They bury Jacob in Hebron, and then they all return back to Egypt. When they return back, Joseph's brothers are afraid maybe Joseph only did not get us back for what we did to him when we sold him as a slave when he was a child. He didn't get us back because he was afraid of his father. But now that his father died, maybe he will harm us. And so they sent someone to send a message to Jacob that your father said before his death that asked that you forgive us. And Joseph cried when he heard that because he was disappointed that his father didn't believe him, that he had fully forgiven his brothers. And he reassured them and he said, do not worry. I fully forgive you. Nothing to worry about. I will take care of you as I promised, and your families for the rest of my life. And indeed, he does that. And the Torah concludes with Joseph dying at the ripe old age of 110 after he sees his great-grandchildren. And that is where the Parsha ends and the book of Genesis ends. And next week, we begin the book of Exodus, where Israel will be enslaved. And we will get to that story, God willing, next week. Any questions on the Parsha? Yes, Eli.
I ask a question about Joseph. Joseph is mentioned in the book of Bereshit about four Parashot, right?
Mm-hmm.
From Toldot all the way to the last one. Anybody else will mention so much?
There's quite a story. Joseph is a central part of the story of the Torah. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Yes. Very good point.
Moshe was mentioned more than Yosef.
Moshe gets more, yes, but Yosef gets a lot. Joseph is a very, very important figure in the Torah. Absolutely. Very good. So let's get straight to our topic for today. Very important topic, the Cairo Geniza. So the Cairo Geniza is without a doubt the most important ancient Jewish find in recent history, and in many ways more important than the other major Jewish find, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls. We once did a class on the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I think we could say without a doubt the Cairo Geniza is significantly more important for our history. It's possibly the most important find at all, historical find ever. The Cairo Geniza is what we know now, 130 years after it was found, a collection that includes about 400,000 books, documents, letters, fragments that primarily come from the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo. What is a Geniza? So the Torah forbids us from discarding holy books or holy writings. So anything holy, we're forbidden from just throwing it out in the trash. Rather, we're supposed to bury it. And most Jewish cemeteries bury Geniza, bury what's called Geniza or hidden, literally means a hidden thing, treasure. And it refers to these holy works that we don't discard, instead we bury. Now, it's not possible every time you have a page of Torah writing that you don't want to discard to go and bury it each and every time. So rather, what Jews have done throughout history is every synagogue would have a Geniza, a room or a closet that people would bring their discarded items, the things that they didn't need, the holy items. And then when it would fill up, they would take it to the cemetery and they would bury it in the cemetery. That's what most communities had. Now, in many places, though, communities grew lazy, and often Genizas piled up in the synagogue, and they did not bother to go and bury them in the cemetery. It's an effort. You got to go, you got to schlep it to the cemetery, you got to dig. They didn't often do that. And that's apparently what happened in the Ben Ezra synagogue, as well as some other synagogues in Cairo. The Ben Ezra synagogue was built in 1025, so exactly 1,000 years ago. It is one of the older synagogues. We have older synagogues than that, but is one of the older synagogues in the world. And was built in a community, the Jewish community of Cairo. Some time ago, we did a class on the Jews of Egypt. What's unique about the Jews of Egypt is that Jews have been in Egypt continuously for 2,500 years, probably longer. They've been in Egypt longer continuously than almost any other Jewish community, maybe with exceptions, some other exceptions, Iran, and Yemen. There's some other communities that might be able to claim that as well. Jews have lived in Cairo, in the city of Cairo, since its founding by the Muslims in the 7th century. So we're talking about 1,400 years ago, almost 1,400 years ago. Since Cairo was founded by the Muslims, Jews have lived there continuously, and it's had a very sizable Jewish community, which means that the Ben Ezra synagogue, until the Jewish community dwindled in the last couple decades, the Ben Ezra synagogue was in constant use from when it was built for close to 1,000 years. Now, unfortunately, there's virtually no one left there. But for close to 1,000 years, the Ben Ezra synagogue was constantly used. And people brought their Geniza, their holy writings, and as we'll see, often not such holy things that got mixed in. People just took the whole, kind of all their papers and kind of shoved them together, and often all sorts of stuff got mixed in. And this continued for close to 1,000 years. And Ben Ezra's synagogue happened to have this very, very large attic that they were putting stuff in. Had a big window above. It has, it's still there. Has a big window above from the women's balcony. In many old synagogues, the men are downstairs, and then there's a balcony that the women sit on. And so from the women's balcony, there is this very large, high up. There is this large. You climb up a ladder. About 10 feet up, there is this large window, and you throw it, and that's essentially the attic of the synagogue, and you could throw it in there, and it's very, very large. So it just kept piling up, and they never bothered to empty it. And so as a result, it ended up with a collection of 1,000 years worth of stuff, of things. An enormous amount of things ended up in there. So, and thanks to the dry climate in Egypt, much of it, and thanks to the fact that they never emptied it, much of it survived. Now, as you can imagine, things from most of it, so Ben Ezra's synagogue fell less into less use in later years. And so after the 14th century, its primary years were between the 11th and the 14th century for about 300 years. Most of its treasures then come from that 300-year period. So it's quite a treasure. Now this Geniza, with all these treasures that have been there for forever, for close to 1,000 years, really only the Jews in Egypt always knew about it. So no one really discovered the Geniza. They always knew about it. Nobody thought very much of it. They just kept dumping stuff there. Nobody ever thought to look to see what people might have dumped there 900 years ago. But as the study of history developed in the 19th century, and as people started seeking out manuscripts, and people started trading in manuscripts, and museums and libraries started collecting valuable ancient old prints and valuable old manuscripts, so people took interest in general in old things, and there were more and more scholars, academics that were studying and looking for these kinds of manuscripts, and so people began to take interest in the Cairo Geniza. The most important removal and the initial study of the Cairo Geniza was done in 1897, so over 120 years ago, by Rabbi Solomon Schechter, who was a Russian-born rabbi and scholar. At this time, he was the Talmudic chair at Cambridge University. So he was a leading historian, a leading scholar in Jewish studies. Cambridge University then, as now, was one of the most prominent universities in the world. He held a very important position, and he was the one perhaps became most famous for excavating the Cairo Geniza. Rabbi Schechter, would later become the dean of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York and the founder of the United Synagogues, which today is the network of conservative synagogues in the United States. He lived long before the conservative movement as we know it today existed. He was maybe an early father of the early organizations that later would become the conservative movement decades after his death. He himself, although culturally Western and an early proponent of what was called the science of Judaism, the scientific study of Judaism, or known better by its German word, Wissenschaft, the science of Judaism. But he was a fully Torah observant Jew and an advocate for strict halachic observance. And he did become famous later for his leadership in the Jewish Theological Seminary. So Rabbi Schechter while he was still at Cambridge was when he emptied the Cairo Geniza, and he really spent the rest of his life, the next 20 years of his life, devoting his life to primarily unraveling the Cairo Geniza. But it wasn't just him, it was countless others. When people discovered the treasure and the value of the Cairo Geniza, many scholars from all over the world, Jews and non-Jews, studied the Cairo Geniza, and many have spent their lives studying the Cairo Geniza. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of books written about various finds in the Cairo Geniza. Thousands, probably tens of thousands of academic articles have been written on the Cairo Geniza. Many books have been written about it. And it's really the Geniza today is found all over the world. Majority of it, the things that were excavated by Rabbi Schechter, as well as some other things, are found today in Cambridge University, which has about half of the documents. About 200,000 of the 400,000 documents are found in Cambridge University. Other collections are found all over. The second largest collection is in Jewish Theological Seminary in New York that have about 30,000. They did not get it from Rabbi Schechter. They got it from They got it from a private collector who had purchased it from Oxford at one point, but they have a very large collection. There are also still large collections in Oxford, in the Bodleian Library of Oxford. The University of Pennsylvania has a very large collection. The British Library, the Hebrew University in New York, and countless other libraries museums around the world, as well as private collections, have collections of the Geniza. Today, the Geniza project, which I'll talk about soon, estimates that there are 400,000 documents in total, found in about 150 different collections that we know of around the world. So how was the Geniza discovered and emptied? So the community in Egypt, as we said, was certainly aware of the massive Geniza they had in the Ben Ezra synagogue, although they likely had no idea how old it was or what its value was. The Ben Ezra synagogue is in Old Fustat. Fustat was the original capital before it was Cairo. It's a suburb today of Cairo. It's an old suburb, and the Jews by the 19th century had long moved out of Old Fustat, so there were very few people still going to. They were still used, but it was not a very active synagogue. However, Jews didn't know about it, and many visitors to Egypt also knew about the Geniza, and many may have even taken things from the Geniza. The first record that we have of someone visiting the Geniza was from a Jerusalem rabbi and famous scholar and researcher, Rabbi Yaakov Sapir, who himself is a fascinating story, and we have to do a class on Rabbi Yaakov Sapir, an amazing traveler who traveled to Yemen and India and Australia and New Zealand. He went to all sorts of interesting places the mid-19th century to visit various Jewish communities. But when he was in Egypt, he describes visiting the Geniza. They wouldn't allow him to actually search through it. They gave him a few small documents, which he looked at, and he did not see much value in it. But by the end of the 19th century, researchers and even tourists visiting Egypt were paying the shamash, the beadle in the synagogue, the person managing the synagogue, to give them documents from the Geniza. It was a great way to make some money, some side cash. In Arabic, they called it bakshish, which is a way you got around in the Arabic world, which is essentially tips. Everything you give a tip, you don't pay. Rather than paying salaries, people preferred to get tips. So they would give them tips, and they would, in exchange, get documents. And various people were coming back with documents. One notable American researcher was Professor Cyrus Adler, who purchased a trove of documents from the Geniza while he was in Egypt in 1891. He brought them back with him. At the time, he was leading a Jewish college in Pennsylvania called Dropsy College. Today, that college has become part of University of Pennsylvania. That trove of documents now are part of the University of Pennsylvania Library. Later, researchers traveled from England, from other places, and brought back various small collections. In 1896, there were two wealthy British women, both widows, who were very wealthy and were spending their lives, they loved to travel. They traveled around, and they also were collectors, looking for ancient things, collecting across Europe, the Middle East. They were particularly looking for Christian things. They were Presbyterian. They were looking for Christian documents. Their names were Agnes Lewis and they were traveling around Europe and collecting valuable documents. And they were on a trip to Egypt. And on their trip to Egypt, Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson. Took me a moment to get the second name. So Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson were traveling to Egypt, and they knew they were from Cambridge. They knew Solomon Schechter, and he asked them, "When you're in Egypt, if you can bring me back some Jewish manuscripts, I'd appreciate it." So when they were in Egypt, they looked for different manuscripts, and they also got some Jewish manuscripts as well from the local Jewish community. They brought it back to Cambridge with them. Agnes and Margaret bring it back to Cambridge with them. They show it to Rabbi Schechter, and he looks at them, and he looks at one of the pages, one of these old documents, manuscripts that he is given, and he notices immediately that this is part of the Hebrew text of Ben Sira, or in Greek known as Ecclesiasticus. Ben Sira, or Ecclesiasticus, is a book of Proverbs that was written in biblical times, a book of kind of wise sayings, wise teachings, that was written in biblical times. However, it is one of the books that were left out of the scripture, out of the Tanakh, when the Jewish sages in the early days of the Second Temple set the Tanakh, set the 24 books of our Holy Scripture. They didn't choose every book available at the time. They left many books out that they felt were not up to par, and the Talmud gives us some explanations as to why various books were left out, including as to why the book of Ben Sira was left out of the Tanakh, out of the Hebrew Bible. However, later, when the Christians put their Bible together, hundreds of years later, it was included in the Catholic Bible as part of what's known as Apocrypha. Apocrypha are a number of books from biblical period that were left out of the Jewish Tanakh, but added to the Christian Bible. They're Jewish books, not part of the New Testament, part of the original biblical era Jewish books, but for whatever reason they were left out of Tanakh and they were added to the Christian Bible. Later, many Protestant denominations have taken out the Apocrypha from their Bible. But Ben Sira is this, but it's definitely this ancient book. Now, we didn't have any Hebrew record of Ben Sira. We had a Greek version in Greek Bibles, a Latin version in Latin Bibles. The Talmud, when discussing Ben Sira, quotes an Aramaic version of Ben Sira, although we don't have that Aramaic version, but at least it quotes verses from Ben Sira in Aramaic. But what was the original language of Ben Sira? So a couple years beforehand, in the early 1890s, there had been a big debate among biblical scholars in England as to what the original language of Ben Sira was. There were scholars who argued that Ben Sira had never been a Hebrew book. It was originally written in Greek, like some of the other Apocrypha were also originally written in Greek, we know. It was originally written in Greek. It was never a Hebrew book. Others, and notably Rabbi Schechter, who was a professor in Cambridge at the time, argued that no, you can prove from the linguistics and from the way the language is written that it was originally a Hebrew book, later translated, only that Hebrew book of Ben Sira is lost. And there had been this big, big argument about it. And now Margaret Gibson and Agnes Lewis now bring back these documents, which include a leaf of the Hebrew Ben Sira. And so Solomon Schechter is shocked because this proves his point. There was an ancient Hebrew Ben Sira, which was clearly the original. And so he is, of course, very, very excited. And he knew that at this point in Oxford, not far away, they had already purchased a number of documents from various researchers and tourists who had purchased documents from the Cairo Genizah. And he knew that Oxford had a bunch of them. So he sent word to the librarian in Oxford to ask him to check the documents they had from the Cairo Genizah and see if they had any documents of Ben Sira. Now, the Oxford University at the time had bought this trove of documents, but they thought that it was worthless. They thought it was worthless, and they actually had already sold it. But they went back and they checked through, and indeed they found multiple additional pages of Ben Sira, of the Hebrew Ben Sira, in the documents that they had. And so Rabbi Schechter immediately decided he needed to go to Egypt to see the Geniza for himself and try to get as many valuable documents as he can. Getting money from Cambridge University, as getting money from any university today, is quite a feat and very difficult. And he did not want to wait because he knew that it would be a race. Word was out. Certainly Oxford University knew about it, knew about this treasure, and certainly word other people will know about it. He wanted to be the first to get it. He got Dr. Charles Taylor, who was the director of St. John's College at Cambridge, to personally fund his trip to Egypt. And he sets out on a boat a few weeks later, sets out to Cairo. Over there, when he arrives in Egypt, he meets with Rabbi Aaron Rafal ben Shimon, who was the chief rabbi of Cairo. He becomes very friendly with him. They, of course, have a lot to share. They're both great Torah scholars, great Talmudic scholars. And he convinces Rabbi ben Shimon to allow him to take the entire collection of the Geniza found in the Ben Ezra synagogue back with him to Cambridge. So together they go to the Ben Ezra synagogue, and they go upstairs to the women's section. And over there in the front of the women's section, there is this big window that goes into the attic of the synagogue, but it's 10 feet high. And they climb up this rickety ladder, and he climbs up, and it's covered in piles and piles of dust, filled with insects and vermin, and no one had been in there for 1,000 years, close to by the 900 years then, but it was for a very, very long time. Rabbi Schechter was determined, although he was coughing up dust. Eventually, he managed to get himself a mask to be able to breathe in there. But he spent 2 weeks there searching through the massive pile of manuscripts and books and scraps. And he's searching through this pile. He hired locals whom he would hand things, manuscripts that he felt were of any value. He hired them to take it down the ladder and bring them down to the floor of the synagogue, where they filled up large sacks with these manuscripts. He spent 2 weeks going through as much as he possibly could from the collection in the synagogue. He fills up many, many bags with documents. And at the end of his 2-week ordeal, he filled these documents in 8 large crates to be shipped back to England. And then he hires a local Jewish businessman who had expertise in shipping to make sure these crates are shipped back to Cambridge. He ended up he wrote in his own article afterwards that he describes he wrote an academic article about the Geniza. He wrote that he took 100,000 manuscripts, but he'd never had a chance in his lifetime to even count them or catalog them. Today, and now that they've all been counted and cataloged, we know there are 190,000 different pieces. Some of them are, a manuscript could have multiple pieces that fell into pieces, and we're still trying to piece together those puzzles. So it could be, one manuscript could have many, many, many different pieces, but 190,000 different pieces we have. Now, almost as soon as he left in early 1897, representatives of Oxford came looking for more manuscripts, and they took many, many, many more manuscripts. Not long after, more people came from other universities, other researchers took manuscripts, and at some point even the Egyptian Jewish community said, why are we giving away all these manuscripts? We should get our own. And they collected what they could find of whatever was left, which itself is a story, because it ended up getting the Egyptian Jewish community ended up leaving Egypt, and it ended up getting lost. And they only found it a couple years ago. It was found in France, this Egyptian Jewish collection, which is now housed in Cambridge University. In all, about what we know of today, about 400,000 different pieces were found, books, manuscripts, and various pieces. So this is by far the largest literary find ever in history. Any questions?
How many of the 400,000 were really significant?
That's a very good question. How many were really significant? I'm going to try to get to that over the class. It depends on what you what you define as significant. Let me answer it now. Depends what you define as significant, and we'll soon talk about that debate about what is significant. But today, any document that says anything from 700 years ago, by its very age, is significant. Because someone sat and wrote that document, and it tells us something about the person who wrote it.
Rabbi,
Yes?
Have they been scanned and are they available?
Excellent question. The answer is yes, and we'll talk about that later.
how do
Yes.
you compare the importance between the Geniza from Cairo and the Yamamela scroll?
How do you compare the Cairo Genizah and the Dead Sea Scrolls? That's an excellent question. Those are easily the two most important finds. You can debate which one's more important. I think the Cairo Genizah, and we'll see why. They're totally different. They're from different periods, different places, have different types of things. It really depends on what you're looking for. Which one had a greater impact on the study of history and on academic study of history? There's no doubt the Cairo Genizah.
What?
The Cairo Genizah. It is many, many times larger.
And the oldest book or whatever in that Cairo Genizah is around 1025.
No, the Ben Ezra synagogue was opened in 1025. We have books from in the Cairo Genizah that are much, much older than 1025. The oldest book that we have that we can date in the Cairo Genizah is from the 7th century.
Did they find any works from the
Did they find any works from Maimonides? Yes, I will get to that. Excellent question.
Really? That's some question.
So arriving back in Cambridge with this massive trove, Rabbi Schechter and his team began sifting through it. Now you can imagine, he has crates and crates of documents, and you got to check each one and figure out what it says. A lot of them are erased, a lot of them are torn, a lot of them are in pieces, right? You got to figure out each one, what it is, what's it about, when's it from, what's it written on, right? All its details. So it's quite a project. The many people in Cambridge were involved in this initial project, but they couldn't focus on everything. Rabbi Schechter himself focused on two main things. The first thing that fascinated him, he was already known as the expert in the book of Ben Sira, and what fascinated him was the book of Ben Sira. So he was searching through the document to find as many Ben Sira leaves as he possibly can. By 1899, 2 years later, he had found, together with others that had taken, 27 leaves of the Hebrew Ben Sira, and he published the first Hebrew version of, at least what they had, of Ben Sira. By 1901, 2 years later, 60 leaves have been found. Remember, they keep looking, right? It's a very long process to look through it. 60 leaves had been found in various Geniza collections that could be identified as belonging to 4 different manuscripts. So each manuscript, each book of Ben Sira or scroll may have fallen apart, and you have many, many different parts. But then there were multiple Hebrew Ben Siras in the Cairo Geniza. In the coming decades, many other leaves of the Hebrew Ben Sira would be found in libraries around the world. Later, they keep getting connected. Later, they would find the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1948. We did a class on those. And when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, there were multiple copies of the Hebrew Ben Sira over there as well, which are much, much earlier. The Dead Sea Scrolls date from before the Common Era, while the more than 2,000 years ago, right? The Cairo Genizah is 1,000 years ago, right? It's a 1,000-year gap, but we did find many earlier Hebrew Ben Siras. So that was one thing that Rabbi Schechter himself focused on. He's continued for a couple years, but then in 1901, he moved to the United States to take the leadership of the Jewish Theological Seminary. He continued studying the Genizah's documents. In the United States, he took some with him from Cambridge, so he did continue studying, but But there were many, many others that would then continue that work as well. So the other thing that Rabbi Shechter focused on is he found this document that absolutely fascinated him. It was this long document that he called the Damascus document, and it was a fascinating description, not of Jews, but of a breakaway group that broke away from Judaism and didn't like the high priest, didn't like what was called the Pharisees, which we once did a class on the Pharisees a little while back, which was an early term for the sages, for the Jewish sages, the rabbinic leaders. And in other words, didn't like the Jewish leaders. They had their own master or leader of light that they speak about, and they had their own rules different to Judaism, and they essentially break away. And there's this very long document discussing essentially this sect. Much later, again, this is something that in 1948, we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. And sure enough, there in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there were multiple copies of the Damascus document, this same document of this same sect. And it's widely believed today that the Qumran sect, there was this breakaway sect that lived in Qumran, and the Dead Sea Scrolls presumably belonged to them. This breakaway group from Judaism, of which nothing has remained, they were the authors of this scroll, and it's describing their own experience. We have no idea how 1,000 years after the Qumran sect disappeared, someone would have somehow gotten a document, copied it, and written, because the one that Rabbi Shechter found was from 1,000 years ago, but 1,000 years after the Qumran sect disappeared, found the document, copied it, and left it in the Cairo Geniza. How that would have happened, we have no idea, but somehow a Dead Sea Scroll was there in the Cairo Geniza. Unknowingly, Rabbi Shechter was fascinated by it. He published it, published an analysis of it, but later we discovered that was the Dead Sea sect. So after Rabbi Shechter, really at the same time, many, many, many scholars continued studying the Cairo Geniza in Cambridge, in Oxford, in the Jewish Theological Seminary, in all the different places where they were. Scholars from different places would visit these various schools to read through, to copy, or they would request the schools to send them copies of various documents to study different documents of the Cairo Geniza. And we kept finding things, because remember, it took years and years and years to go through these documents. It wasn't like, and they kept coming back, and there was another box that had not yet been opened, and there were boxes that hadn't been opened at all. Whole sections that had maybe been put aside because they weren't considered all that important, right? And so they kept finding more and more and more things. They found early copies of the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, which is the primary Talmud, an earlier version of the Talmud known as the Jerusalem Talmud, copies of the Mishnah, copies of Midrashim. Some of these copies of the Talmud differ slightly from our own versions of the Talmud. It included Midrashim, which are early classical era from about the beginning of the Common Era till about the year 500. Early works that we were unaware of even existed. For example, we have a book called the Sifra, on the book of Vayikra, Leviticus. We found over there at least a part of a Sifra on the book of Bamidbar, on the book of Numbers. We have a midrash called Mechilta on the book of Exodus, and we found a Mechilta on the book of Deuteronomy, on the book of Devarim. So we found countless midrashim that we didn't know existed. We also found countless tshuvot, responsa of the Gaonim. So responsa were rabbis from around the world were always asked halachic questions. If the local rabbi doesn't know the answer to the question, what does he do, right? He's just a local general practitioner rabbi. He goes to the expert, right? And so he would reach out to what was called a posek, great leading figure, who would answer the question. And that answer became known as a tshuva, or the English word is responsa. In a couple of weeks, some of you have already seen the emails, we're going to be doing a class focused on Jewish responsa, itself a fascinating story and a fascinating insight to Jewish life throughout history from these responses. So we have responsa, kind of these letters and on Jewish law, which also are addressing practical things that happen, right? Events that happen. This is what happened. What is the law in this case? Is it permitted? Is it forbidden? Are they allowed to marry? Are they not allowed to marry? Is the divorce valid? Is it not valid? Is this thing kosher? Is it not, right? So it'll ask questions so you know then the details, right? You hear the story. So it gives you a lot of historical insight. It also tells you what the halachic analysis was. So we have many responsa throughout history, from the end of the writing of the Talmud, which was about the year 500, going all the way till modern times. Now, the rarest responsa would be what we call Tshuvot HaGeonim, the responsa from the Gaonic period, which primarily came from the leaders of the schools in Babylon, who were the leading sages of Israel at the time, during the period of between about 500 and 1,000. Known as the Gaonic period. We once did a class on the Gaonic period. And it's on the podcast if you want to learn more about the fascinating Gaonic period. But it's the reason why it's very hard to come by those tshuvot, those responsa, is because it's a long time ago. Not a lot survived from more than 1,000 years ago. So we have many manuscripts, and we have many tshuvot, and many books of tshuvot HaGaonim have been published of responsa from the Gaonim, but they're very hard to come by. Well, in the Cairo Geniza, we found a huge trove of responsa from the Gaonim from that period. Why? Well, it's very simple. The Gaonim mostly lived in Babylon. Babylon at the time was the center of the caliphate, of the Arabic Empire, which stretched all the way from India all the way to Spain. And they would send letters westward to communities all across North Africa, in Kairouan, which is modern-day Tunisia, in Morocco, in Fez, in Morocco, in Cordoba, in Spain, and they would send these letters. They would go back and forth. In those days, there were no planes. You would travel, send it by boat or by caravan, and it would make different stops. So a letter would go through the community from Egypt to Morocco to Tunisia from Spain to Morocco to Tunisia to Egypt and to Babylon, and then it would go back along that path. And what likely happened is when people would receive the question and the answer, there was a great thing to have to record. The local community would record it before passing it on. And so an enormous amount of tshuvot, of response of the Gaonim, end up in the Cairo Geniza, and many that we otherwise have no record of. The earliest, we also found countless tshuvot, countless responsa from the Rishonim, from medieval scholars from that period, including from Maimonides, including many handwritten works of Maimonides. Now, we have other handwritten works of Maimonides. What happened to Maimonides' original manuscripts and collection is a story of its own. But a lot of that has survived, not in Egypt, it ended up leaving Egypt. But in the Geniza, we found many letters from Maimonides. He wrote to people, he wrote himself, his own handwriting that we have, including halachic answers that he answered, tshuvot, questions that people asked him, and he answered, and that he answered. The earliest work that we found is Avot de Rabbi Natan. Avot de Rabbi Natan is a commentary on the book of Pirkei Avot, of Ethics of Our Fathers, written right after the Mishnaic era, so in around the early 200s. And the manuscript that we have is dated back to the 600s. So it's very, very old. It's by far not only the earliest manuscript in the Cairo Geniza, it's by far the earliest manuscript of our oral tradition. Well, we have many early manuscripts of the Tanakh, of scriptures, especially once we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's the earliest manuscript we have from the oral tradition, from the Mishnah, the Talmud, or any of the oral teachings that started to be written around the year 200. This is the earliest thing that has survived. Now, many of the finds that we found were not only Jewish finds. We also found, surprisingly, a lot of Christian finds. Now, why would that be? This Geniza was only for Jews. It was in a synagogue, and Jews would bring their holy Jewish papers of Torah to the Geniza. So that's because of something called palimpsests. Palimpsests are, what happened was, in ancient times, paper was very, very hard to come by. It was extremely, extremely difficult. They mostly wrote on papyrus and parchment, things that were very, very hard, very expensive. And mostly when they wrote, they used inks, not like today when we write in paper, where once you write it, there's no way to take it out. The inks that they used then were inks that essentially sat, similar to what we have today in our Torah scroll, that sit on top of the parchment. So a scribe could then come with a scalpel and essentially scratch off the ink. And that's what they would do. When they would find an old document, instead of throwing it in the garbage, they would reuse it. They would scratch off the ink, and then they would rewrite on top of it. And this was very, very common, and many, many ancient manuscripts are palimpsests where I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, that they wrote over an earlier document. And today, with technology, we're able to actually, the original writing always leaves a mark. With technology, we're actually able to bring out the earlier writing and read that earlier writing. Now, amazingly, many of the documents in the Geniza were palimpsests written over Christian writings. Early Bibles or early biblical writings or early other Christian writings. Why? Well, we don't know for sure, but until the 7th century, Egypt was part of the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine. So it was Christian. It was only when the Muslims came in the mid-7th century that it became Muslim. So there were probably a lot of Christians that fled, that were killed, that were gone, left behind papers. There's lots of Christian papers, not so many Christians left in Egypt. What happens to all those papers? Well, people take them, they're worth money. People take them, erase what was on it, and resell them. And they sold them to Jews who wrote their Torah writings on them, and they didn't know or pay attention to what had been there originally, and they wrote their Torah writings on there, and then they ended up in the Geniza. So it also revealed a lot of early Christian things were found in this Geniza, thanks to these palimpsests, these earlier writings that we found. Now, yes?
I was going to ask you, was that during the forced Arabization of the area?
During the forced Arabization of the area. I don't know if there was forced Arabization, but there was an Arabization, yes.
What were they made them convert?
I don't know.
They made Christians and Jews.
They generally did not make Jews and Christians convert.
They would kill them or convert them. No?
I don't believe so. That's for another time. Okay. So many of the manuscripts in the Geniza, if not perhaps a majority, are prayer books or prayer poems or things that were written for prayer, right? Those are the things that everyone has. Everyone has prayer books. That's always what wears out the quickest. And so many of the things that we have are prayer books, Haggadahs, poems to be recited in prayer. Now, many of these prayer books that we found, they're all manuscript, all handwritten. Many of these prayer books are different from the prayers that we are familiar with today. Why is that? So, in ancient times, in the post-Second Temple period, there were two major Jewish communities. There was the Jewish community of the Persian Empire, which covered Iraq, Iran, went all the way down to Afghanistan, India, and that Central Asia. And that community was centered in Babylon, which was by far the largest Jewish community, modern-day Iraq, centered around these great yeshivas in Babylon. And that's where the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, was written. And then the other large community was the Roman Jewish community. The Roman community was around the Mediterranean. It was centered in the land of Israel and in Egypt, North Africa, modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor, Greece, Rome, going all the way to France and Spain. The Persian Jewish community was probably larger, definitely more successful. They were known as the Babylonian community. Their center was in Babylon. The Roman Jewish community, their center, although the largest community was probably not in Israel, the center was in Israel. The center of scholarship, the center of learning, the great yeshivos, the Gaonim were in the land of Israel. So they were known as the Eretz Yisrael community, the land of the Israeli community. So there were these two major Jewish communities. It's widely these communities ended essentially with the Arab conquest of Israel, Syria, and all of North Africa and Spain. Why? With the Arab conquest, many Jews from Babylon moved to the new Arabic lands, Syria, Israel, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Spain, and these were all Babylonian Jews. And within a century or two, the Babylonian Jewish communities in all these places easily outnumbered the original Eretz Yisrael community, Israeli community in these places. There did still remain small Israeli communities in these places that would be affiliated with the existing Israeli communities. It wasn't really centered in Israel anymore, but Israeli communities in Byzantine, what would be modern-day Turkey, Greece, Italy, France, that were Christian lands. They were much smaller, and over time, those communities adopted most Babylonian traditions. Although historians believe that the variation, the differences, many of the differences between Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews can be traced back to these different Israeli and Babylonian communities in the before the Arab conquest. So, but regardless, in Egypt itself, during this period, there were two communities. During the Arabic period, there were two communities. There was the larger Babylonian community and the smaller Eretz Yisrael or Israeli community that had been there originally, that had been there first. The Ben Ezra synagogue, we know today, was an Eretz Yisrael, an Israeli synagogue. It belonged to the Israeli community. And therefore, the people that were bringing their books to the Ben Ezra synagogue, Geniza, were Jews who were from the Israeli tradition. And so the prayer books they had were prayer books of the Israeli tradition. And therefore, they look quite different from the prayer books that we are familiar with today. Now, notably, one of the most notable differences between these two traditions is that the Babylonian Jews had this custom that they would read the Torah every single year. They split the Torah into 54 portions, and they would read the Torah over the course of the year, ending the reading of the Torah every Shabbat. They would read a different portion, a different section, ending the reading of the Torah on Simchat Torah. That custom today has become universal, like most Babylonian traditions. The Eretz Yisrael, the Israeli Jews, however, they would read the Torah on a 3-year cycle. They had over 150 portions, and they would read the Torah over 3 years, ending the Torah every 3 years. Many of the prayer books and chumashim that we found in the Ben Ezra synagogue from that period are the 3-year cycle. Furthermore, many poems were found in the Geniza. Many of these poems were poems that were not recited by Babylonian Jews, but were recited by Israeli Jews. In fact, we know that the medieval scholars, the Rishonim, we call them, write about the greatest Jewish poet by the name of Yanai. Yanai was the teacher of Elazar Hakalir, who's the most prolific poet that we have. We have more poetry from him than anyone else, and his poetry is widely used in our synagogue still till today. In fact, I think we could venture to say that majority of the poems we use in our prayers on the high holidays and other times are from Elazar Hakalir. His teacher was Yanai, and his teacher Yanai was considered the greatest Jewish poet. But we didn't have any poems from him. We have all of 3 poems from Yanai. Well, when they found the Cairo Genizah, as they went through the poems, we found over 800 poems from Yanai. We also discovered why we lost Yanai's poems. Most of Yanai's poems were written to be read in the synagogue every Shabbat, and were written to connect to the weekly Torah reading. So each poem, he wrote a poem on each Torah reading, and they were written to be read in the synagogue on Shabbat, and each week connected to the Torah reading, a different one each week. But that Torah reading system no longer exists. That follows a Torah reading system with 150 parshas. It follows a Torah reading system that we don't use anymore. But we stopped using those poems then, and we lost his poems. Thanks to the Cairo Genizah, now we've found them.
What are they called again? What are they called again?
Piyot in Hebrew for poems.
What are they? Yeah.
Piyotim is the Hebrew for poems. Now, Yanai, as far as we know, Yanai is the first poet to ever use rhyme and meter in poems. He is the earliest one. He lived in the land of Israel around the 600s, and he was the first one to use meter and rhyme in his poems. There is rhyme from earlier, even the Torah itself, Tanakh has rhyme, but it's usually one-line rhymes, not long poems where the entire poem is rhyme. His student Elazar Hakalir and many other subsequent poems copied that. The Christians in the round land of Israel, who at the time spoke Syriac, copied it as well and started writing in rhyme. And later, Greek and Latin writes copied it as well, and it eventually became, later Muslims copied it for Islamic poetry, and it eventually became universal, but he seems to have been the one to have invented it. And yet, we knew nothing about him or his poems until we found the Cairo Genizah.
I have a question.
Yes, Ellie.
You said the Jews from Eretz Israel, they read the Bible within 3 years.
The original Eretz Yisrael custom, which was the custom in the Roman Empire prior to the Arab conquest.
Okay, but is it the same Bible or is it a longer one that was?
Much shorter. Each parsha was a third of the size. The portions were a third of the size of what we had today. Yes.
Shorter.
Yes. And we have Chumashim, we have books that we found in the Cairo Genizah that break up how they broke up the portions.
150.
Yes, so we know how they broke up the portions. Yes.
But
Yes.
you said he's the first poet that would write something more than one line that rhymed. Is that of the Jewish people or in the world?
In the world.
In the Greeks, Romans?
Everyone. They copied us. We started.
Wow.
One day we'll do a class on Jewish poetry. I think we have one scheduled in the coming months. But a lot of Jews were first in poetry in a lot of things. We were very creative when it came to poetry.
So when they found these poems, did they find his name on them?
Yes. So another thing that Yanai invented is what's called in English acrostic, which is that when a poet writes a poem, they put their name into the poem. After Yanai, pretty much every Jewish poet after that continued to do it regularly. Put their name in the poem, in that they would have the first letter of each word in the first or last line, or the first letter of each line, or the last letter of each line would spell their name. So became normal in almost all Jewish poetry. Yanni was the first one to do it, so every poem has his name in it.
So did he by chance put the date on there or not, or they were just able to match the poem to the,
We know when he lived.
okay.
So we have an idea of when he. Had they know which poem went to which parsha? Yes, they match the poems to the parshas.
What language with those poems?
In Hebrew. So now the original researchers, Rabbi Schechter and the next generation of researchers, they focused on literary works. There were so many literary works, books of Talmud and books of Midrash and books of prayer and Haggadahs and poems. There were so many amazing and books of scripture and even the Christian Bibles that were found underneath. There were so many literary works that they focused on. Everything else they considered to be garbage. It was mundane. It wasn't all that important. However, by the mid-20th century, researchers realized that this stuff is not unimportant. There was a lot of other things there. There were ktubot from people's marriages. There were marriage agreement documents, what we call t'naim. There were divorce documents. There were letters people wrote to each other. There were love letters that couples wrote. There were deeds of sale. There were contracts. There were just journals that people wrote. All sorts of things that people wrote. Diaries. There were even children's textbooks, school textbooks in there. People just took their whole stash and threw it in. In fact, we know because certain people keep coming up again and again and again. Why does the same person's thing have, one person have a few hundred documents? Because they took their whole stash and just threw the whole thing in the Geniza. Maybe after they died, their children had no use for it, and they just threw the whole thing in the Geniza without even going through it. So historians quickly realized this gives an unbelievable entrance to what life was like in the Middle Ages. We have no other trove of documentation anywhere that gives an open window into people's lives. You basically have people's entire literary output, every document they wrote, every letter they wrote, essentially put together in this stash. You could trace people's lives. You could trace what life was like during this period. Primarily for Jews living in Egypt, but there's letters from all over the world. There's letters from Kiev. There's letters from Europe, from Spain, from all sorts of places from this period. Mostly in Hebrew, but they're not only in Hebrew. There's even a Yiddish letter written. There's letters in Greek and letters in Arabic, lots of letters in Arabic, and letters in Latin and in many other languages. And it gives you a window not only to what Jews in Egypt were living, but what people in general were living. An entire work was written about the trade between Egypt and India between the 11th and 14th centuries, based on documentation from the Cairo Genizah. So one researcher, Dr. Shlomo Dov Gotain, who was a professor at Princeton, he pioneered this research, and he put together with a whole team of helpers a massive 6-volume set of life in the Middle Ages based on the Geniza. One volume focusing on the economy in Egypt in those days, one focusing on the community, one on the family, one on daily life, one on the individual. Fascinating discoveries. And there are countless, really a class on the Cairo Genizah, I'm already over time, class on the Cairo Genizah can go on for weeks, months. There's whole courses in university, people who have spent their lives dedicated to studying the Cairo Genizah. There are tens of thousands of academic papers, hundreds, not thousands of books have been written on the Cairo Genizah. So we could go on and on and on and on. But just to share a couple fascinating discoveries. We found in the Cairo Genizah a song, many songs, there's a lot of poems, a poem written about Moses. But what's unique about this song is that along with the poem, there's actually sheet music to tell you how to sing the poem, how to play it. Now, That's unusual because Jews don't use sheet music until hundreds of years later. Sheet music had been invented in Italy a little just before this period, just before around the 10th century, and was being used in by Christian musicians at this time. But Jews did not use sheet music at that time, and they weren't writing in sheet music. So we didn't know where it came from. But then, and remember, there's all these different documents spread all over the place. One researcher finds one thing, and then a few years later, another researcher finds another thing. Later, we discovered an autobiography. We had actually earlier found a number of related letters, but we found an autobiography in the same handwriting as this poem, and it tells us the story of a young man from Italy, from Oppido in Italy, by the name of Johannes, who had studied to become a priest. And he was drawn to Judaism. And then he heard the news that the Archbishop of Bari, which is a city in southern Italy, had converted to Judaism and fled to Arabic lands, to Muslim lands. And so he decides to follow him. And he converts to Judaism. And he then travels to Aleppo, which is Muslim in Syria, outside of Christian reach, right? Because a Christian who converts in Christian lands would be killed. So he travels to Aleppo, and over there he goes through he studies Torah, and he gets letters of approbation, which we found the letters as well. And then he just travels to Baghdad, where he joins the yeshiva in Baghdad. He becomes part of the yeshiva, but still had a yeshiva there in Baghdad. Then he leaves Baghdad, travels back to Aleppo, and eventually he ends up in Egypt. And it tells us his whole life story. He took on the Hebrew name of Ovadia. Ovadia was a name of a prophet who, according to our tradition, was also a convert. And so he takes on this name of Ovadia. And the researchers realized that this Ovadia, the convert, this Italian former priest who had converted to Judaism and fled to Egypt, and about whom we've also found letters of approbation and a letter testifying of his conversion in Italy, all in the Cairo Genizah. He's the author, because the same handwriting, of this song about Moses, and he would have written the sheet music, and it makes sense because he was a trained Italian priest. And in those days, Italian priests would learn music and they'd learn sheet music. And what's amazing is that today we are able to, because we have the music, we're able to actually play it. And if you go on YouTube today, you can search for the song of Ovadia the Convert, and it is available. People have done it, and you can hear it on YouTube. Another fascinating discovery. We mentioned earlier that we found multiple letters of Maimonides. Now, Dr. Shlomo Dov Gotain, he spent a lot of time researching trade between Egypt and India. There was a lot of trade, a lot of ships going back and forth. Egypt was essentially the gateway between India and Europe during this period. And so, and he through the Cairo Genizah, he wrote a whole book on the trade between Egypt and India. Well, there's one very, very famous Jew in Egypt who traded with India, and that was David Maimonides, the brother of the Rambam, of Moses Maimonides. The Rambam, Moses Maimonides, writes in a letter, that is a letter we had for a long time, that his brother David supported him, and that's how he was able to spend years studying Torah without having to work, without having, to make a living. He was supported by his brother, who was a businessman that went to traded, I believe, in gems in India. And he writes how his brother died at sea, his ship sunk, And as a result, together with the family fortune, and as a result, he went into depression, and he didn't leave his room for a year, and eventually, though, he's forced to seek work, and he was trained as a doctor, so he becomes a doctor, and eventually he becomes the doctor of the Sultan. So we all knew that was part of history, right? That was part of our history. So a professor once challenged Dr. Gotthein, have you ever found any letters from David Maimonides to his brother Moses Maimonides? And so he began to search for it. And sure enough, we found the letter. He found the letter. He found the letter. Now, I should mention that in the letter that Maimonides writes about his brother's death and how pained he is and how depressed he is over his brother's death, he writes that he holds his brother's letter in his hand. And every time he sees the letter, he cries. Well, we found, Dr. Gotthein found a letter that signed by David Maimonides, saying that he is now in the port city in Egypt, and he had gone there to find merchandise, and there was nothing worth buying to bring back to Cairo, and so he decided that he needs to travel to India. It's very dangerous right now to go to India, but nevertheless, he doesn't have a choice. He has to do it, and so he's sending a letter to his brother, letting him know, take care of my family while I'm gone. It's going to be a long trip, or if anything happens. We have a date on the letter. We know when the letter was written. It was written 1169, right before Maimonides wrote about David's death. It was likely the final letter that Maimonides received that Moses Maimonides, the Rambam, received from his brother David. So we have that letter. Another fascinating story. One more. So, and there's countless of these. There's so many of these. 400,000 documents. Another fascinating story. We had in the couple hundred years ago, someone wrote a history book, and in this they wrote that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was a great Jewish poet and a great Jewish writer. He's the author of a book called Kuzari, one of the most important books of Jewish philosophy. And he lived in Spain, in Barcelona, in the 12th century, around the same time as Maimonides. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi wrote a lot. He wrote a lot of poems about Israel, about the land of Israel. He very much wanted to go to the land of Israel. So, and we have a tradition that he went to the land of Israel. So someone wrote this story about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi going to the land of Israel, how Rabbi Yehuda Halevi spent his whole life wanting to go to the land of Israel, and at the end of his life, he finally makes it to the land of Israel, and he comes, and he lived during the period of the Crusaders in the 12th century, and he comes to Jerusalem, and when he arrives at the gate of the Jerusalem, he gets off his horse, and he gets down on the ground to kiss the ground, and just as he is down there on the ground, an Arab rider comes and tramples on him, and he dies at the gates of Jerusalem. That's the story that was told. Well, historians highly doubted this story. How would someone who lived 400 years after Rabbi Yehuda Halevi know such a story without any written record for it anywhere? How would they know such a story happened? Where would it come from? Right? Who recorded it? Why is there no other record of such a story anywhere? And so therefore historians figured that, like many, many other stories in our history, there's many folk tales, right? And stories that grow, and who knows if they're true or not. And so historians strongly doubted this story. All sorts of other reasons, the years don't add up, and the reasons why it wouldn't work. Well, guess what? In the Cairo Geniza, we found a letter about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's death, being killed in Jerusalem. The detail that it was at the gates of Jerusalem isn't mentioned there, but the fact that he went to Jerusalem and was killed there is mentioned in the Cairo Geniza. So we definitely know that to be a fact, essentially proving what had been a folktale to actually really be true. And there are countless other stories like that from the Cairo Geniza, and still stories coming out, research still being done. One other important thing to mention is that on top of all of the fascinating manuscripts that we've found, we've also found a lot of medical manuscripts. Manuscripts of potions, manuscripts of medical healing, even medical manuscripts from Maimonides himself, who was a leading doctor and wrote a number of medical books. And there's people who have devoted their lives to studying the medical manuscripts in the Cairo Geniza, and many books have been written just about the medical manuscripts found within the Cairo Geniza. So where's the Cairo Geniza today? So for many, many years, it was really all over the world. About half of it was in Cambridge. The rest was spread out in more major collections in a dozen different libraries, minor collections in dozens and dozens of different libraries. And researchers had a very, very hard time finding things, especially since most of it was never cataloged. So you don't even know what you're looking for. You don't know what to look for. And often there are different pieces. There are one half is found in one library and the other half of the same paper found in the other library. Very, very hard to connect them. Or sometimes it could be multiple pieces of a paper or multiple leaves of a book found in different libraries, right? So very, very hard to connect them, very hard to make any sense of them. In the late 90s, a number of Cairo Geniza researchers came up with this idea that we need to bring it all together. How are we going to bring it all together? Well, firstly, to make a single catalog of all Cairo Geniza things everywhere in the world. And then secondly, to digitize everything. And so they started a project known as the Friedberg Digitalization Project, sponsored by Albert Friedberg, a Jewish philanthropist in Toronto. And he hired a fellow called Dr. Yaakov Schwecka, who is both a computer scientist as well as a manuscript digitalization expert, and to lead this project. And at first, a lot of the libraries were hesitant to be part of it, even though they were going to digitalize it for free. They weren't, they were going to pay for it. A lot of libraries were hesitant. A lot of libraries are very protective over their collections. But slowly, first Cambridge agreed, which has the bulk of the documents. Cambridge agreed to digitalize it, which required actually cataloging everything that Cambridge had. A lot of things had never been cataloged. There were whole piles and boxes that were just sitting there and were never cataloged. Cambridge had always thought they had 100,000 pieces. Well, they cataloged it and they ended up with 193,000. So they discovered they had a lot more than they thought they had. They just didn't know. And so over the years, it has been all cataloged. Close to 400,000 pieces, which are thought to be more than 98% of the Cairo Geniza, has been cataloged and digitized. Today, all of it is available online on the Cairo Geniza project website. And today, anyone is able to go, any researcher is able to go to it and find, if you know what you're looking for, you could find any document. You could search just by name. A person may be mentioned in the document, or by subject, and you can find documents. They also built software to help match documents, where if documents look similar, each catalog includes not just a picture of the document, of both sides of the document, because sometimes it looks blank, but it's not really blank, both sides of the document, and as well as a description of what it's made of, when we estimate that it's from, and any other details about it, is all there in the catalog. And so today, they have software that actually works to connect the pieces together. So you're actually using software can say, are there any other matching pieces anywhere else in the collection? And so this really, really made life much, much easier for Cairo Geniza scholars, but it remains a big project in the process, almost 130 years after it was originally emptied out by Rabbi Schechter in 1897. And it remains a big project, and it has given us an enormous wealth of understanding of ancient Judaism in medieval times or even earlier, what life was like for Jews and Muslims and Christians in medieval times. It's given us an enormous window into history, clarified so many things that we were unaware of, given us so much more information, and it really is, I think we could say without a doubt, the greatest Jewish find ever, if not the greatest, definitely the largest trove of documents ever to be found, but perhaps the greatest, the most significant find ever. So that's the story of the Cairo Geniza. Again, thank you for joining. Thank you, Louise and Marcy, for sponsoring our breakfast this morning. We definitely could use more sponsors going forward. If anyone's able to help in any way, we'd greatly, greatly appreciate it. It's the end of the year, so you get your tax deduction in before December. And then next week we will be back. Next week we're going to talk about the story of Moses and the snake. So you're going to come to hear that story next week. And I don't usually go 2 weeks ahead.